Good day everyone, I am Leslie C. Rafael. In this video, I will be going to discuss all about the assessment in learning English. In this lesson, you will be able to define assessment of learning, apply assessment strategies in the conduct of instruction, and understand the general use of assessment in teaching English. So what is assessment? Assessment is conducted to determine whether the learners know, understand, and are able to perform knowledge and competencies required of them. So from the word assessment, it is used in education to describe a wide range of methods that educators employ to evaluate, measure, learning progress, skill development, and educational needs. Importance of assessment. First, we have assessment provide diagnostic feedbacks. Here, it is known what should be taught, what is the current ability and knowledge of the students, and what else do they need. Second, assessment helps educators set standards. Assessment also helps in setting up teaching standards. Through assessment, we know that performance show learning, knowledge, and efficiency. Third one, assessment also is evaluating progress. We can find out which methods are the most active in teaching. We will also know if we need to change our teaching style or the tasks we give to students and even what we teach. And here, we will know where the level of the students' learning is. Fourth one, assessment relates to a student's progress. What have students learned? Can they show what they have learned, or do they have the ability to apply what they have learned? Assessment is important to a learner so that he or she can understand his or her strengths and weaknesses regarding the material learned in class. And lastly, assessment motivate performance for students' self-evaluation. A student may ask, now that I am in charge of my learning, how am I doing? Now that I know how I am doing, what can I do to make it better? So assessment helps students to enhance their learning. Next slide. Assessment could be viewed in three lenses. We have the assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. On the screen here, we have the different definitions of these words. Okay, the first one, we have the assessment for learning. This is a type of assessment that determines the learner's background, knowledge, and skills, and trades their progress in understanding. Second, assessment as learning. This type of assessment is a more learner-centered approach. This lets the learner reflect on the results of his or her progress and plans the next steps to improve performance. And lastly, we have assessment of learning. This is the more traditional view of learning as it measures the learner's attainment of the learning objectives or goals of the lesson or of the standards. So to further understand the three lenses of assessment, let's have it one by one. Let's start with the assessment for learning or assessment para sa pagkatuto. Assessment for learning means you check the students' learning as they are going through the course. So assessment for learning means you check the students' learning as they are going through the course. The emphasis on the word for suggests that this type of testing helps students see what they are learning as they are move through the course. So assessment for learning takes in two types. We have the diagnostic and formative assessment. So diagnostic assessment, it is a type of assessment that is given before instruction. It is done or given to students before starting the discussion of new topics or lessons or before starting in a course. form of pre-assessment that allows a teacher to determine students' individual strengths, weaknesses, knowledge, and skills prior to instruction. So the result of the diagnostic assessment are recorded but not graded. This is a reference for the teacher so that she or he knows where competencies he or she will emphasize. So, the example of a diagnostic assessment might be a form of pretest that identifies a student's readiness to learn a particular topic or level of the topic. So, for example, in a situation, I am a teacher of elementary level, and then it's my first time to meet my students. And then I didn't know what their weaknesses or what their background knowledge about the certain topic that I will going to discuss to them. So the things that I will do is that I will be going to give them an pre-test before I start my discussion para malaman ko kung ano yung mga kahinaan nila. Next, formative assessment. Formative assessment serves as a means to check the effectiveness of instruction. It measures students' existing knowledge of the proposed lesson context. So this is an assessment done during the instruction. So it is an ongoing type of assessment which is conducted during or at the end of lessons or a series of lessons. This can be in the form of a short answer test, fill in the gaps, group quizzes, or whatever seems useful to check the learning for that lesson or group of lessons. So formative assessment is labeled the assessment for learning because the student gets lots of feedback about how well they as learning. So it is given while the teacher is in the process of student learning. It ensures the learning is going on while teacher is in the process of teaching. So, forms of formative assessment. The formative assessment can be given as a quiz or assignment under formal assessment. And it can be informal through simple questioning, review, class recitation, asking for generalizations, and insights from students. So the result of formative assessment is recorded but not graded also. So, reference ito ng mga teacher o guro para malaman nila kung anong adjustments ang kanilang gagawin. It can be used to evaluate what students know at a particular point so that the teacher would intervene to meet the lessons or course objectives. Let's say, for example, the teacher will give the students a questions A, B, C, D so that she will know if the students have understood the discussion about the lesson that she is discussing. Another example is the teacher asking her students to draw a concept map in class to represent their understanding of a topic. So the goal of formative assessment is to improve learning attainment over time. So we do this so that we can see if the child has achieved the topics or knowledge they should already know before teaching or introducing a new topics. That means, in assessment for learning, teacher examines all the activities that have in the class. It is the formative form of assessment that the teacher is using the results of the activities to adjust her teaching. So that is the assessment for learning. So let's move on to assessment as learning, or assessment bilang pagkatuto. So, it occurs when students reflect on and monitor their own progress to inform their future learning goals. So, students set their targets, monitor, and evaluate their own learning in relation to their set target. It is done also for teachers to understand and perform well the role of assessing for and of learning. So, this is what we call self-assessment, peer assessment, and evaluation. So it involves students in the learning progress where they monitor their own progress, ask questions, and practice skills. This is also formative in nature that using testing itself as a learning experience. So it considers how learners self-regulate their own learning and in so doing make complex decisions about how they use feedback and engage with the learning priorities of the classroom. So it is a self-directed and it develops independent learners. Examples: reflected journals, reflection, and insights. Example, a student uses the testing experience as a tool for personal growth. So, test and learning become better as a result. Next, let's proceed to the third one, the assessment of learning. It is also known assessment ng natutunan or pagkatuto. It is use of a task or an activity to measure, record, and report on a student's level of achievement in regards to specific learning expectations. The assessment for learning means you test the students at the end of the course. It is given at the end of a unit grading period or a term like semester. So these are often known as summative done at the end of a task, unit of work. It occurs when teachers use evidence of students' learning to make judgments on students' achievement against goals and standards it assesses for teaching for grading purposes. So this is also called a summative assessment. So summative assessment, it is done or given after teaching the students everything we need to know in a particular lesson. It can be given as a unit test, chapter test, midterm exam, final exam, quarterly or periodical exam, achievement, tests, assignments, or projects. So the summative assessment is considered assessment of learning because based on the results of the summative assessment, malalaman kung pumasok ba ang performance ng estudyante sa standard o nakuha ba niyang i-meet ang mga objectives at na-master niya ba ang competencies sa isang aralin o kurso sa loob ng itinatalagang instructional period. So everything is finally given in the summative assessment with instructions, expectations, and grading rubrics. So the result of the summative assessment is recorded and graded. Example, here are the examples: periodical tests, prelim, midterm, semifinals, finals, assignments, and projects. So again, this is the three lenses of assessment, purposes of assessment. So we have the assessment for learning or AFL. This is done by the teacher formatively to improve teaching learning process. It usually occurs throughout the teaching and learning process to clarify student learning and understanding. Next is the assessment of learning or AOL. This is also done by the teacher summatively or at the end of the unit of grading purposes. It occurs when teachers use evidence of student learning to make judgment on student achievement against goals and standards. Lastly, the assessment as learning or AAL. This is done by the students to monitor their own progress. That's talking about their reflection and insights. It occurs when students reflect on and monitor their progress to inform their future learning goals. So these are the three lenses of assessment. Let's move on to the next slide. So what is assess? So the teacher in the classroom would focus more on the following areas to assess under the K-12 curriculum. We have the content standards, performance standards, learning competencies, and concept development. First, content standards. So content standards These are the essential understandings that the learners should learn. It basically answers the question, what should the learners know, as stipulated in the K-12 curriculum. So, content standard statements that describe what students should know or able to do within the content of a specific discipline or at the intersection of two or more disciplines. So, from the word itself, what do you expect from students or pupils to learn from the content of what you are teaching? Example would include students will classify objects along two dimensions. Next, performance standards. These are the abilities and skills that learners must be able to demonstrate in relation to the content. So, performance standards clarify content standards by describing what evidence is acceptable in determining whether content standards have been met. So use clear descriptions to describe quality work, include concrete examples, include explanations of how well students must learn or demonstrate the content, explaining how good is good enough, and also you have a goal by the end of your topic that your students or pupils will be able to identify and read. For example, the subject and predicate na topic. They can identify what is subject and what is predicate in a sentence which is connected to your content standard. Next, we have the learning competencies. These are knowledge, skills, and attitudes that learners have to demonstrate in every lesson or activity. So, learning competencies are the main ideas or skills you expect students to master. So, these are also called goals. Next, concept development. This is a measure of how the learners are able to progress in the attainment of the standards. Concept development is important because it forces the teacher to have a very clear understanding and definitions of what is being taught, and it provides a written reference for students, especially in English learners. Concept development is important so students can generalize new situations in school and real life. Students need a good foundation at the conceptual level so they can apply the concepts they have learned to new situations. For example, students can calculate how much paint is needed to paint a wall because they immediately recognize that this involves determining area. So it also relevant because all students should be able to describe the concepts being taught. So here are the example of curriculum map. As you can see there, they have content standards, performance standard, learning competency, learning activities or strategies, evaluation assessment strategies. So here are the example. Next, how are learners assessed? So learners' progress is not only based on the tasks given to them, but also on the learning that takes place within the classroom and in different settings outside of the classroom setting. From this information about the learners gathered by the teacher, assessed in the classroom, would follow a cycle. First, define learning outcomes. So each program should formulate between 3 to 5 learning outcomes that describes what students should be able to do, to know, and appreciate following completion of the program. It describes a wider range of behavior, knowledge, and skill that makes up the basis of learning. Example, learners can reliably demonstrate how to use de-escalation techniques to neutralize conflicts. Next, create assessment activities and assess the learning outcomes. Multiple ways of assessing the learning outcomes are usually selected and used. Although direct and indirect measures of learning can be used, it is usually recommended to focus on direct measures or learning levels of student performance for each outcome is often described and assessed with the use of rubrics. Next, analyze learners' results. It is important to analyze the results of the assessment in a meaningful way. So we need to examine or analyze carefully so that to identify possible learners' results. And lastly, make adjustments to the next lessons based on the results analyzed. Next slide. So summative assessment or assessment of learning. So, summative assessment is typically administered at the conclusion of a specific instructional period. As what I have said earlier, everything is finally given in the summative assessment with instructions, expectations, and grading rubrics. So the purpose of summative assessment in the traditional sense is to evaluate learner performance usually at the end of the quarter, term, or a year. It provides the teacher and understanding of how the learners fare against the set standards in the curriculum. Summative assessments are usually the basis for grades of learners or teachers. So common summative tests are periodic or quarterly examination, final project or creative portfolio, final performance, demonstration or report, chapter test or end of unit test, standardized tests like NAT and CEE and others. So that's the example of summative assessment. And that's all. I hope you understand my discussion in this video. Thank you so much.